Robbins Lectureship was established just a few years ago by Earl Robbins and his family. Mr. Robbins is a graduate of Berea College, and he's been very faithful to the college over the years. He's been a real believer in the principles that it stands for, among them racial justice and equality. I take real pleasure in introducing you to Mr. Robbins and some of his family here tonight. Earl, would you stand and accept applause from us as a token of appreciation? And I'd also like for you to meet two of his children, Sylvia Robbins Griffin and Bill Robbins. Welcome to you. I'm going to make the introduction to the speaker tonight as brief as I can, but the story is so rich that it will be tempting to take more time than I should, and also don't want to take away from the speaker's speech, because I think he may want to also tell this story. Every college has a legend like ours, maybe one or two, and I think I've talked to some of the freshman class as well. People needing cows at college for tuition. Berea is one of those that had a cow there to it. In this case, it was a young man named James Bond who walked 75 miles from Anderson County, Kentucky. He says in later life he wrote at the age of 16, "With all my belongings in a pillowcase and driving a steer, I started out to get an education. Walked the entire distance of 75 miles to Berea College, where a few years later my brother Henry followed me." James Bond graduated from Berea College ultimately in 1892, the year that President Frost became president of the college. And he was the boy with the cow. He not only graduated from Berea, he served on the board of trustees. 4 years after graduation, see if any of you can accomplish this. 4 years after graduation, 1896, he came on the board of trustees and he served until 1904, when the infamous Day Law was passed. And then he went on to other great works, founding of the Lincoln Institute. His name appears on the document that lays out the plan of what to do when the Day Law is approved by the Supreme Court. And he is one of the ones who was the chief architect of the Lincoln Institute. He also was very, very more than fond of, highly respectful, I guess is the phrase, of John G. Fee. And he wrote in his memorial to Fee something that I think we would say about James Bond himself. Listen to what he said about John G. Fee and substitute Mr. Bond's name for it. I say to you today, if you would see the monument of John G. Fee, look around you. He has erected a monument more lasting than brass or granite shafts that pierce the skies, a monument whose foundation rests on principles as eternal as God, and whose body is more than the brick and stone and mortar about you. Thousands of loving hearts who have had their inspiration in him and in the Christ he loved and preached. He was great in his work. Berea is his monument. And I would say the same applies to James Bond. Not only all these accomplishments, but he fathered Horace Mann Bond, who became president of Lincoln University and was a very important nationally recognized, internationally recognized educator. He was also the father of James Max Bond, who coincidentally became president of the University of Liberia during its life. And he just happened to be the grandfather, through Horace Mann Bond, of the gentleman who is going to speak tonight, Julian Bond, Horace Julian Bond. Julian Bond visited Berea 2 years ago, but we didn't know it. He sneaked in and out without our knowing it, but he was here last officially and spoke to this college campus in 1975 during Black History Week. I looked at the the program for that evening to see what somebody had to say about him, or maybe he had to say about himself. And he, at that point, was thoroughly immersed in state politics and the civil rights movement. And at one point he said, "We are changing the color of Southern politics." And about himself, he said, "I am a politician." I don't know if he would say that about himself tonight, maybe a different kind of politician, but still very much interested in public life and public issues. He's a graduate of Morehouse College. He was elected at a very young age to the Georgia House of Representatives and then to the Senate. So he's very, very active as a political figure in state politics in Georgia for many years. He was a very significant figure, as most of you who know about civil rights history would recognize, in the civil rights movement, being a co-founder of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, a group I came back to my consciousness recently when I was reading a book by Robert Coles, who was also involved in those early days interviewing and working for SNCC. Currently, he's a writer. He's a professor at the University of Virginia and at American. He lectures all over the country, in fact, all over the world. He'll be lecturing next in Newcastle, England. He has his own TV public affairs program that's on every other week. He's quite active still, and quite active in issues of justice and peoplehood, and it's a great pleasure to introduce him to you, and I'd ask you to help me warmly welcome him as a Berea kind of person.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you a great deal for that kind introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your warm welcome. You've probably heard it said by countless speakers before me what a great pleasure it is to be here. And so it is a great pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here in many different sorts of ways, not the least of which does have to do with my former profession. As you've heard, I used to be a politician. I know that's not the most popular profession to be in the United States today. And so it's a great pleasure when one of us is invited anywhere by anyone. It's a shame, really, the profession is not held in higher repute, because it is such an important profession. You know, it's the people who do what I did who decide whether or not you will do what you do. It's a relatively ancient profession. There are many who believe it to be the world's second oldest profession. But nonetheless, I'm just proud to know that for 20 years, I belong to the finest body of men that money could buy. It was a Berea graduate who first brought me to this campus in 1975, Carter G. Woodson, the creator of what in my youth was called Negro History Week and now known as Black History Month. As the president has said, 2 years ago, or a year ago actually, in 1992, my wife and I were driving from her home in Minneapolis to Asheville, North Carolina, to Cincinnati, and quite naturally had to come this way. And I saw the sign on the highway, and I said, let's pull off here. Spent a pleasant afternoon walking about in this community. And I had not the ability then to recall that this would have been the 100th anniversary of my grandfather's graduation from this college. And so I'm pleased to visit here once again and to walk where he walked before me. The history of the Bond family intersects with the history of Berea. Like so many others, we are an American family, and like so many American families, our history is in part a history of our nation's attempt to come to grips with race. My great-grandmother, Jane Bond, was the second daughter of a slave named Martha and a slave named Henry Crockett, who belonged to the Virginia family that made the Crockett name famous across the frontier. Their daughter Jane, who took the name of her master, Jane Arthur, her most frequent companion was one of the Arthur daughters, 7 years older than she. When that daughter married Preston Bond, a young farmer and preacher from the Bluegrass region, Jane was given to the new bride as a wedding present. Relationships between the slave and her new master were sometimes strained. He threatened at least once to beat her. She responded by threatening him with a knife. But when his wife became pregnant, he acted as did countless slave masters before and after him. He took her slave as his mistress, and they had 2 children, both boys. She had begun to found an American family. When she died in 1921, she had 15 grandchildren. I recently came across a pencil-written note dated July 1969 from one of those grandchildren, my late father, Horace Mann Bond, to me. He wrote about the first of Jane Bond's children, his father, James Bond, born in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky on September 5th, 1863. The date of his birth and the location of his birth made him a slave, if having been born a slave mother had not been enough. In English common law, status had descended to the children from the father. If your father had been a free man, you would be a free man too. But in the American slavocracy, status descended from the mother to ensure the master's children from his slaves would be slaves themselves. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued 4 days before my grandfather was born, didn't become effective until January of 1864. It furthermore accepted slaves living in areas not under federal control. James Bond therefore technically remained a slave until the 13th Amendment was adopted in 1865. He was born a slave to a slave mother and remained a slave till freed by the 13th Amendment 2 years after his birth. He and his brother were part of a transition generation of Americans of African descent, a generation born in servitude, freed by law, determined to make their way as freedmen, and make their way they did. Barely able to read and write, he left his home at 16, walking the 75 miles to Berea, with his belongings, as you've heard, in a pillowcase and his tuition, a steer, on a rope beside him. His brother Henry followed soon after. In 13 years, he graduated from high school and earned a bachelor's degree from Berea College. He received advanced degrees from both Berea and Oberlin, and met and married a wife there, and held pastorates in Birmingham, Nashville, Louisville, was a member of Berea's board of directors, and a founder of Lincoln Institute, established by Berea's trustees to educate Kentucky's blacks after passage of the infamous Day Law in 1904. 1904 was the year my father was born. He graduated from Lincoln in 1919. And so I stand before you then as the descendant of slaves and the descendant of a Berea alumnus, himself heir to the traditions taught by Berea's founder, John Fee. And I want to begin with my grandfather's hopeful words at John Fee's funeral to talk about difficulties and problems we face today. James Bond said then, "The false partitions set up to separate classes and races are falling down. Illogical and unchristian distinctions, though still disgracing the age and hampering the spirit of progress, must soon yield to justice and right, then forward in the struggle for advancement. Wrong for a time may seem to prevail, and the good already accomplished seem to be overthrown. But forward in the struggle, inspired by the achievements of the past, sustained by a faith that knows no faltering, Forward in the struggle. Behold the dawn of a brighter day. You may not see it, but it will soon come. Well, over the past few years, we've all seen the dawn of a brighter day. We've seen the Soviet Union collapse upon itself. We've seen the Berlin Wall come down. We've seen Israelis and Arabs meet across the peace table. And we will see other such hopeful events in the future as well. In a few years, all of us here, God willing, will see what almost no American living now has ever seen before: the birth of a new century and the death of an old. That will surely be an occasion for reflection on what has happened in our times, for an examination of the past to see how it can inform our present and our future. There is some time for reflection now. Only a little more than a century ago, the Emancipation Proclamation became law. 50 years ago, the world was at war. Between May and August of 1943, race riots swept through American cities, resulting in 40 deaths. 25 years ago, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were assassinated. The Tet Offensive in Vietnam shook Americans who had been confident our side would prevail. Richard Nixon was elected the 37th President of the United States. The Kerner Commission decided that white racism was the principal cause of 1967's racial riots, and warned that the United States was heading toward two societies: one white, one black, separate and unequal. 5 years before that, 30 years ago now, John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and Lyndon Johnson became the President of the United States. 30 years ago this past August, 250,000 Americans gathered in Washington for what was one of the largest demonstrations of civil rights forces ever gathered together in this nation, announcing the dawn of a new day. Well, for the last several years, I've been a college history teacher, examining this past, explaining to college students about the great movement for civil and human rights that swelled to prominence in the United States in the 1950s and the 1960s. Most of my students, too young to have any personal memories of that time, tend to confuse George Wallace, the governor of Alabama in the 1960s, with Mike Wallace, the television newsman then and now. Others confuse the leader of the Montgomery, Alabama NAACP, E.D. Nixon, with former President Richard M. Nixon. And they are confused, as are many of their elders, about what that movement's aims and goals were, what it accomplished, where it failed, and what their responsibilities are to complete its unfinished business today. What and how I teach them reflects a great change in historiography, a rethinking today of by whom and for whom yesterday's civil rights movement was made. As we look back at that movement from today, we now see a different view of the events and the personalities of that time. Instead of the towering figures of Kennedys and Kings, we now see an army of nonviolent women and men. Instead of famous orations made to multitudes, we now see the planning and the work that preceded that triumphant speech. Instead of a series of well-publicized marches and protests, we now see long organizing campaigns and brave and lonely soldiers often working in near solitude. Instead of prayerful petitions for government's deliverance, we now also see aggressive demands and the ethic of self-help. We now realize our view of the movement's goals was narrow too. Instead of integrated lunch counter seats alone, that movement wanted to own the lunch counter. Instead of front seats on the bus alone, that movement wanted to own the bus company too. And instead of a sudden upsurge in black activism in Montgomery in 1955, we now see a long and unceasing history of challenges to white supremacy that began as long ago as slavery time. And instead of a movement that ended in 1968 with the death of Martin Luther King, we now see continued movement, stretching forward from then until this moment, with different forms and personalities, in many places and locales, with differing methods and techniques, whose central goal has always been the elimination of strictures based on race. Now, when we look back on our time today from the 21st century, what is it that we will see? If we look at today, at the early 1990s and the 1980s, through the same narrow lens we used to use to examine the 50s and the 1960s, we may only see the electoral and ideological victories of the forces of retrenchment and reaction. If we take that narrow view, we will say that conservatism created a backlash against the liberalism of the 1960s and rode it into power, discrediting and then weakening the government's efforts to help the poor and the powerless, strengthening the effort to reward the rich and the mighty. We will conclude that trickle-down evil triumphed. We will mourn that the forces of decency and good were vanquished in an unparalleled explosion of bigotry, greed, and callousness. While that is certainly an accurate reflection of what actually happened in the last decade and a half, it supposes that these evils had been asleep and then awakened, born again as the 1980s began. In fact, these evils are ever present in our society, and the history of our country and the history of our freedom struggle is a never-ending fight between right and wrong. As evil has been consistent, so has good. As evil has sought privilege for the few, good has insisted on peace and prosperity for the many. And the movement for racial and economic justice has fought its battles on a variety of fronts, choosing each as circumstances dictated, changing and adapting its means and methods to the circumstances it confronted. It has long followed a plan articulated when the 20th century was new, a plan which fits our circumstances exactly today. In 1905, as the state of Kentucky closed its school doors to its black citizens, the late scholar W.E.B. Du Bois proposed. "We must complain," he said. "Yes, plain, blunt complaint, ceaseless agitation, unfailing exposure of dishonesty and wrong. This is the ancient, unerring way to liberty, and we must follow it." Next, he said, "We propose to work. These are the things that black men and women must try to do. We must press the matter of stopping the curtailment of our political rights. We must urge Negroes to vote honestly and effectively. We must push the matter of civil rights. We must organize business cooperation. We must build schoolhouses and increase the interest in education. We must bring Negroes and labor unions into mutual understanding. We must study Negro history. We must attack crime among us, to do all in our power by word and by deed to increase the efficiency of our race, the enjoyment of its rights, the performance of its duties." This is a large program, Dr. Du Bois said in 1905. It cannot be realized in a short time, but now is the critical time. From even before his time until today, black Americans generally followed his prescription for action, pursuing civil rights, economic justice, entrance into the mainstream of American life. The years since then saw gains won at lunch counters, at movie theaters, at bus stations, at polling places, and saw the fabric of legal segregation come undone. What had begun as a movement for elemental civil rights is today largely a movement for political and economic power. And today, black women and men hold office and wield power in numbers we only dreamed of before. But despite impressive increases in the numbers of black people holding public office, despite our ability now to sit and eat and ride and vote and go to school in places that used to bar black faces, in some ways, non-white Americans face restrictions more difficult to attack and defeat today than in the years that went before. Until the last presidential election, successful recent candidates for the nation's highest office frequently painted a picture of America many Americans never saw. For them, America was a land composed entirely of happy families and successful suburbs, where every child waved an American flag, where every day was the 4th of July. But there was then and is now another America, a shadow America these politicians dared not show or tell. For much of the decade of the 1980s, it was presided over by an amiable incompetent whose sole intent was removing government from every aspect of our lives. Coming to power with him were a band of financial and ideological profiteers who descended on the nation's capital like a crazed swarm of right-wing locusts, bent on destroying the rules and laws which protect our people from poisoned air and water and from greed. But nowhere was their assault on the rule of law so great as in their attempt to subvert, ignore, destroy, and attack the laws which require an America which is bias-free. They recruited a constituency of the comfortable, the callous, and the smug to form solid ranks against the forgotten. They tried to enforce the national nullification of the needs of the needy, the gratuitous gratification of the gross and the greedy. They practiced the politics of impropriety, prevarication, pious platitudes, and, dare I say it, self-righteous swinishness. They forced a kind of triage economics upon us, producing the first increase in American infant mortality rates in 20 years and pushing thousands of poor and working poor Americans deeper and deeper into poverty. By the middle of the decade of the 1980s, the Census Bureau reported that the number of Americans living in poverty had increased over the previous 4 years by 9 million, the biggest increase since these statistics were first collected over 2 decades ago. Even today, the poorest 2/5 of our population receives a smaller share of the national income, and the richest 2/5 a larger share than at any time since 1947. Over the last 5 years, income for the bottom 1/5 of our population went down by 9%. For the top 1/5, it went up by 32%. And for that 1% at the very top, after-tax income went up by 102%. They increased American interference in the lives of our neighbors in this hemisphere and in other countries around the globe. Criminal invasion in Grenada, U.S.-sponsored terrorism in Nicaragua and Angola, encouragement of white supremacy in South Africa, these are the legacies of these years, the decade of the dominance of greed. Those years were a kind of festive party thrown for America's rich. The middle class got by on 2 paychecks. Median family income was stagnant. The percentage of young families who owned their own homes went down for the first time since the Depression. More Americans were working longer hours at lower pay. And for those Americans whose skins are black or brown, the rate of poverty went up while median family income went down. For all children, the numbers living in poverty had doubled by '87. Poverty for black and Hispanic senior citizens went up. Children who were poor got poorer. The gap between rich and poor grew wider. For these families, it was never morning in America. The only shining points of light they saw were daylight through the cracks in their walls. Within a few years, after 1968, when the Kerner Commission concluded that white racism was the single most important cause of continued inequality in income, housing, employment, education, and life chances between whites and blacks, the growing number of blacks, of women, of other minorities, pushing for entry into and power in the academy, the media, business, and government, created a backlash in the discourse over race. The previously privileged majority exploded in angry resentment at having to share space with the formerly excluded. Opinion leaders began to reformulate and redefine the terms of the discussion. Instead, black behavior became the reason why whites and blacks lived in separate worlds. Racism retreated, pathology advanced. In a kind of nonsensical tautology, you heard over and over, these people are poor because they are pathological because they are poor. The failure of the lesser breeds to enjoy society's fruits became their fault alone. Thus, pressure for additional civil rights laws became special pleading. America's most privileged population suddenly became a victim class. Aggressive blacks and pushy women were responsible for America's demise. All this occurred despite almost daily incidents of racial attack and a series of public opinion polls which demonstrate many Americans believe racial minorities are less than equal human beings, lacking in thrift, morality, industriousness, and patriotism. According to a Gallup poll, the average American thinks that 18% of all Americans are Jewish. The real figure is 3%. The average American thinks that 21% of all Americans are Hispanic. The real figure is 8%. Most Americans think that 32% of all Americans are black. The real figure, of course, is 12%. In the opinion of too many of our fellow citizens, Bill Cosby and Willie Horton are the same man, equally undesirable as neighbor, schoolmate, co-worker, defender of our common soil. This blame shifting and role reversal, where victim became perpetrator and victim status became cursed, occurred as a result of an organized and orchestrated campaign. Like the president whose victories gave it sanction, it too aimed at removing government regulation from our lives, and it found a handy, hated target in civil rights. While professing strong support for equal rights, they opposed every tool designed to achieve this goal. They attacked and discredited affirmative action, not only because it threatened ancient skin privilege, but because it served as a handy symbol of despised government intervention. For these new racists, equal opportunity was a burden society can't afford to bear. Their less than subtle message was that including blacks and women excluded quality. They argued that the beneficiaries of race-centered affirmative action were somehow profiting from it, as if the movement's goals were an investment shared by greedy few, a sub-tribe of ebony Ivan Boski's trading up life's ladder. There is no profit, of course, in receiving right treatment. Receiving rights others already enjoy is no benefit or badge of privilege. It is the natural order of things in a democratic society. The continuing disparity between black and white life chances isn't a result of black life choices. It stems from epidemic racism and an economic system dependent on class division. Abundant scholarship notwithstanding, there is no other possible explanation. Not family breakdown, not lack of middle-class values, not lack of education and skills, not absence of role models. These are symptoms. Racism is the cause. Its elimination is the cure. There is an item on the civil rights agenda, economic justice, largely unaddressed and today unfulfilled. Since the heady days of the 1960s, too many have concentrated too much on enriching too few, while the large numbers of working-class black Americans, like their counterpart in the larger society, have seen their income shrink and their jobs disappear. King lost his life supporting a garbage workers' strike in Memphis. The right to decent work at decent pay remains as basic to human freedom now as is the right to vote. Negroes, King said in 1961, are almost entirely a working people. There are pitifully few Negro millionaires and few Negro employers. That there are more black millionaires today is a tribute to the movement King led. That there are actually fewer blacks working today is an indictment of our times and our economic system, a reflection of our failure to keep the movement coming on. Well, if the future promises expanded freedoms in Eastern Europe and in Southern Africa, we are right to ask what changes we may expect here at home. There are some changes we have already seen. The presidential election last year ended more than a decade of retrogression and retreat. The new administration so far has done some good, promised more than it has delivered, and made some awful backward steps all its own. At the same time they break promises on Haiti and Dumplani Guinea, they step forward to protect workers' rights to organize and women's right to choose. And they've embarked on an ambitious plan to ensure that each of us will no longer have to choose between paying the rent and paying the doctor. It is ironic to note this week that the same band of isolationists who cheered when we attacked tiny Grenada, who waved the flag when we tried to subvert democracy in Nicaragua, and when our brave troops conquered Panama, cannot stomach keeping our commitments to bring an end to starvation in Somalia or to restoring democracy in Haiti. There is much else to remind us that elections alone cannot and do not by themselves make the changes that are required. When I was young, bad boys fought with knives, not with automatic weapons. Crack was something that if you stepped on it, you'd break your mother's back. Songs were about June and moon, not about bitches and hoes. What is it that makes these young men so fearful of women, or so concerned and confirmed in their powerlessness that they compensate by trashing their mothers, their girlfriends, and their wives? An Urban League report tells us earlier this year that black Americans lost, not gained ground in the 1980s. And on the streets and sidewalks where black America lives, crime and violence are the rule. Homicide is the leading cause of death for 15 to 34-year-old black women and men, and 95% of these murders are black-on-black crimes. These are not drive-by shootings or stranger killing stranger. In most of these deaths, the killer, the victim knew each other. These are friend shooting friend. In life chances, life expectancy, years of education completed, median family income, by all the standards in which life is measured, Black Americans see a deep and widening gulf between the American dream and the reality of their lives. We tend now to look back on the King years with some nostalgia, as if these were the only years in which we were truly able to overcome. Our inability to do so today is caused, at least in part, by the way we recall Martin Luther King. For most of us, he is little more than an image seen in grainy black and white television film, pictures taken in Washington 3 decades ago, the gifted preacher who had a dream. But King, of course, was much more than that, and the movement much more than Martin Luther King. He did more than tell the nation of his dream at the March on Washington. In the years before and after, he addressed the human condition in all its aspects and the larger world beyond America's shores. He isn't the only soldier missing from the freedom fight. He was part of an army that numbered tens of thousands. In many ways today we have become King dependent, summoning his memory as a substitute for action. But we forget that he stood at the head of a mighty movement, at the head of thousands of Americans who helped make that mighty movement what it was. He didn't march from Selma to Montgomery by himself. He didn't speak to an empty field at the March on Washington. There were thousands marching with him and before him, and thousands more who did the dirty work that preceded the triumphant march. Black Americans didn't march to freedom. They worked their way through civil rights, through the difficult business of organizing, knocking on doors one by one, registering voters one by one, creating a community organization block by block, building a statewide movement town by town, creating interracial coalitions nationwide. Today we look on others to lead and direct us. Yesterday we told the leaders where the people were, what the people wanted the movement to do. The people who worked and won in yesterday's movement didn't stand around wringing their hands asking, what can I do? What is my role? They didn't say, I wish the NAACP or Dr. King would take care of this. They didn't say, we'd better wait till everyone agrees on what we're going to do. Instead, they looked at the problem, considered some solutions, and moved ahead. There is today enormous opportunity for service available to each of us, wherever, whomever we happen to be. From the block club to the Boy Scouts to the Girls Club to the PTA to the local political campaign, there's nowhere willing hearts and minds aren't welcome, nowhere they will be turned away. In the nation's capital where I live, each weekend, over 6,000 women and men from all walks of life engage in neighborhood anti-drug patrols. So far, they have closed down 200 crack houses and eliminated over half the city's open-air drug markets. In community after community, urban and rural, all across the nation, women and men are continuing a tradition older than the United States itself, neighbor helping neighbor to solve problems one can't solve alone. Most of us here tonight are or will be successful in our lives. Many went before us to smooth our way, our job to smooth the way for those who come behind. There's much, much more that needs to be done. We've let our infrastructure, our streets, our roads fall apart. For many in the middle class, only mom's paycheck keeps them out of the poorhouse. For others, mom's paycheck is the only one they have. Many Americans can't afford to be sick, can't afford to pay the doctor when they are. Yet we still find enough to pay the military machine. In just 3 years in the 1980s, we spent more than $1 trillion on military expenditures. Friends, that is an enormous amount of money. To understand just how much that $1 trillion can buy, let's take 6 states in the American heartland in the Midwest as an illustration. With that $1 trillion, we could build a $75,000 home, put it on a $5,000 lot, furnish it with $10,000 worth of furniture, put a $10,000 car in the garage, and give the house, the lot, the furniture, the car to each and every family in Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Iowa. And friends, we'd have some money left over. After we've given every family a house, a car, and a lot and furniture in those 6 states, we'd have enough money left over to build a $10 million hospital and a $10 million library, and put that hospital and that library in each of the 250 towns and cities in Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Iowa. And friends, we'd have some money left over. We'd have enough money left over after we've given every family a furnished house with car and lot, after we've given every town a hospital and a library. We'd have enough money left over to equip 2 armies. We'd have enough money left over to set aside at 10% interest enough money to pay a salary of $25,000 each for an army of 10,000 nurses, and $25,000 each for an army of 10,000 teachers, and put those 10,000 teachers in each of those libraries and the 10,000 nurses in each of those hospitals in each of the 250 towns and cities in each of the 6 states where every family has a house that's furnished, a car, and a lot. And when every family has a lot, when every family has a house, when every family has a car, and when every family is living in a town with a well-staffed library and a hospital, we'd have enough money left over to give each family in those states an annual cash allowance of $5,000, not just for 1 year, not for 2, not for 3, but from now till the end of time. Now, friends, that is an awful lot of money. Unfortunately, for too many Americans today, the fight for equal justice is a kind of a spectator sport, a kind of an NBA in which all the players are black and the spectators white. But in this true-to-life competition between good and evil, the players are of every color and condition. The fate of all the fans tied to the points scored on the floor. When good prevails, the spectators win too. When 4 little girls died 3 decades ago in a Birmingham church bombing, Sally Ride won the right to shoot the moon. Because black young people faced arrest at Southern lunch counters 30 years ago, the law their bodies wrote now protects older Americans from age discrimination, protects Jews and Muslims and Christians from religious discrimination, protects the disabled from exclusion because of their condition. It took but one woman's courage to start a movement in Montgomery, the bravery of 4 young men in Greensboro to set the South on fire. Surely there are men and women, young and old, here tonight who can do the same. If there are hungry bodies near these walls, someone here can feed them. If there are precincts of the powerless poor nearby, someone here can organize them. If there is racial injustice nearby, someone here can conquer it. If America still spends more on guns than butter, someone here can reverse that ancient trend. When I entered the labor force more than 3 decades ago, there were 5 workers making contributions to the Social Security system for every retiree. We don't know who they were, but I'll bet their names were Carl, Ralph, Bob, Steve, and Bill. When I retire from the labor force in fewer years than I want you to know, there are going to be 3 workers paying in the system for every retiree. We don't know who they are, but their names may well be Kwanzaa, Maria, and Jose. You need to make sure they have the best futures they possibly can. My grandfather's words, spoken at his commencement here 102 years ago, have some meaning for us here today. He said then, the pessimist from his corner looks out on the world of wickedness and sin, and blinded to all that is good or hopeful in the condition and progress of the human race, bewails the present state of affairs and predicts woeful things for the future. In every cloud he beholds a destructive storm, in every flash of lightning an omen of evil, and in every shadow that falls across his path a lurking foe. He forgets that the clouds also bring life and hope, that the lightning purifies the atmosphere, that shadow and darkness prepare for sunshine and growth, and that hardships and adversity nerve the race as the individual for greater efforts and grander victories. Greater efforts and grander victories. That was Berea's promise to him. That ought be our promise to tomorrow. Thank you.